Hello, everyone, and welcome to your regular afternoon session of the Pisces Guide to Pop Culture. I'm, of course, your host, TJ West. Now, after earlier talking about Omnivorous and my love of doing my newsletter, I wanted to switch up gears a little bit and talk about this new novel that I just finished for our Queer Romance Book Club. Once again, a shout out to the Buzzword for their fantastic work and in not only supporting queer romance and other queer lit and writers, but also hosting this lovely book club, which, as I said last night, gives me life. But anyway, to the matter at hand, A Banh Mi for Two, which, by the way, let's talk about this cover before I get into it, is gorgeous. I love the sprayed edges, as we know, and I love the design. Pardon the interlibrary loan sticker there. It strictly says do not peel off. But anywho, this was a great book. It had some issues, which I'm going to talk about, but overall, I really did enjoy it. It's a very brief book. It's only 220 pages. And what's the name of the author, who is Trinity Wynn. I think that's how you pronounce the last name. If I'm mispronouncing it, I sincerely apologize. Has crafted a really important story, because I think one of the things that has been really remarkable about queer publishing, and also just publishing in general, is this growth of Asian and Asian American voices in all kinds of genres, in romance and romantasy and fantasy. And I think that's definitely a good thing, because we all know that publishing, despite some of its claims to the contrary, is still very much a white person's game, and it's nice to see that there are publishers who are willing to take a risk on stories like this one. So what is this book about? It is about two characters, Vivi, a Vietnamese American young woman, and Lan, a Vietnamese young woman who runs a food stall with her mother. Vivi comes to Saigon basically without her mother realizing it, because her mother's never really told her anything about her background, her life, and so Vivi is desperate for this, so she comes to Saigon, again claiming that she's in Singapore. And then she meets Lan, and then the two of them have this, sort of instantaneous spark and this huge, coming together that really allows each of them to fall in love, but also grapple with some of their family stuff. I think that while the romance is a key part of this book, for me, what was more, I think, impactful and I think more successful narratively was the sort of engagement with some pretty big issues, among them, the immigrant experience, family trauma, grief. I think these are all things that are really important, and I think that the power of romance, as I've talked about here before, is that it provides us the comfort of knowing what's going to happen. Like, we know there's going to be a happily ever after, but it gives us the comfort of that, with also grappling with these weightier issues. And I think that that's one of the selling points of both escapist literature generally, but also fiction in particular, like genres that rely on tropes, I think are very good vehicles, effective vehicles for grappling with these issues, because to some degree that you're going to get a happy ending, but you also are kind of immersed in this fraught space. And it's very, what's striking about this book is that each character really has a lot of baggage. For Vivi, she has long felt kind of out of place as a Vietnamese American, and it doesn't help that neither of her parents have much of a founding, like, they don't have much to share with her about her homeland, their homeland, Vietnam. Whereas for Lan, it's even more acute, because she struggles with guilt over the death of her father. And, that's something that I think many of us who have parents who are either, older or who have had health trouble can identify with. I know I certainly did. And so, when these two characters fall in love, they each find a source of support and strength that helps them navigate this stuff. And there's some, not to sell the romance, there are some lovely sequences. They go to a festival together where they sort of bond and have lovely, romantic but also intercultural exchange. It's one of those moments where Vivi kind of feels in touch with her mother's homeland in a way she hasn't been before. And there's a third act breakup, but it's that's probably one of the least impactful parts of the book. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more engagement. And not, this is a spoiler alert, it does end happily. They do get back together, but there's some outstanding questions, like the most pressing of which is the fact that Vivi's an exchange student, and so therefore is going to have to return to the US at some point. But when you're dealing with romance, sometimes it's okay to just embrace the happily ever after. You don't need to have all the questions answered, particularly since both of these characters are very young, like 18, 19, 20. So, I think that helps to explain in part why they don't have to think about the future too much, because, the future will kind of fend for itself. Certainly when you're young, you don't always think through things as thoroughly as you probably should. And now that I'm 41, I can't say that I think through everything the way that I should. So I sympathize with that. And so, overall, I would highly recommend this book, both because of its themes and the things that it addresses, but also because it's just a fun, quick read. And when it comes down to it, there's a lot of, white sapphic romance out there, and I think it's a really good thing that we see this expanding boundary of what queer representation can look like. And I'm going to talk about this in a future episode, but one of the things that also strikes me is that there's not a lot of queer romance set in Southeast Asia, not that I've read, and I don't think that most Americans would be familiar with. And so I think that it's really important that we all, as queer people, kind of read outside of our normal comfort zone, and that we encourage voices like this, because I do think that these stories, while they may not hit every note, which is fine, it's important that these voices are elevated, particularly in today's environment where, it becomes increasingly clear that we're living in a hostile era, a hostile and deeply xenophobic era. And so it seems to me that stories like Vivi's and Lon's are even more vital than they would have been in previous periods. And I think that, one way of showing our support and, our, what do I want to say, our embrace of these other stories is to read books like this, to encourage our book clubs to read books like this, because the only way that publishing as an industry gets the message that these stories are important and that people will value them is if people read them, and if people buy these books and they recommend them to others. So consider this the official Pisces Guide to Pop Culture stamp of approval and recommendation. Pick it up for the beautiful cover. Can't go wrong with pink, but stick around for the lovely sapphic queer Vietnam romance, which is very messy, and these characters are very silly sometimes, but we can't help but love them. And really, that's the bottom line. If I love a character, if I feel invested in their lives, then that to me is a mark of a good fiction. It's a mark of good romance. So anyway, highly recommend it. Bond Me for Two. Check it out. Buy it from your local bookstore or buy it from an indie bookstore if you can. If not, just read it wherever you can and get your hands on it. So thanks as always for tuning in. This is the Pisces Guide to Pop Culture. I'm, of course, your host, TJ, and I will catch you next time.